But there's an important moment to stop being the fledgling and really start to soar high. Like that was the goal, is I wanted to soar way up there in the clouds, if we're using a bird analogy, leaving the nest. Um, and that can be scary too, because you wonder, am I going to stop selling? Are the galleries going to start to kind of not want to show my work because they're bigger and they might be weird, they might be scary, they might embrace grotesque themes. Galleries start to go, about that. That's a challenge that the artist can face as they start to leave that fledgling stage of being an artist, a new artist, and start to move into their more mid-career, maybe.
Welcome to the BoldBrush Show, where we believe that fortune favors the bold brush. My name is Laura Engelbayer, and I'm your host. For those of you who are new to the podcast, we are a podcast that covers art marketing techniques and all sorts of business tips specifically to help artists learn to better sell their work. We interview artists at all stages of their careers, as well as others who are in careers tied to the art world, in order to hear their advice and insights. For today's episode, we sat down with Noah Buchanan, a large-scale realist narrative painter with a deep love for the old masters, Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. We discuss his personal hero's journey as an artist, the importance of looking within and to your past to rediscover your voice as an artist, why storytelling not only helps connect you with your buyers, but also with a piece of humanity, and the challenges that many realist painters face in the business side of art. Finally, we discuss the Big Stories exhibition that Noah helped curate, as well as his online classes and workshops. Well, welcome, Noah, to the BoldBrush Show. How are you today?
Thanks, Laura. I'm great. It's really exciting to be here, and it's always a pleasure to talk with other talented painters like yourself. So thank you for having me.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And you too, kudos. You've got some massive, you're doing the narrative, like incredible, huge paintings that, of course, a lot of us in the narrative communities can only dream of doing, especially because, when you're doing big paintings, you need a lot of space, which is kind of hard to come by sometimes when you're, just starting out. So
yeah,
you are goals.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And speaking of, I'm also really excited to have you because I think we have a sort of kindred spirit connection, because I'm also a huge, huge fan of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, and how the light and shadow aspects and the archetypes, and especially because, when you are a narrative painter, those are very key important figures to look into when you want to tell a story and you want to convey it to a public that mostly has disconnected itself from the stories that have lasted generations. I feel like today people don't connect as much with, I guess, stories that have been told again and again and again. My opinion, of course, but I do sense there's been a shift. And now the storytelling has mostly been movies, which we will also talk about. But first, do you mind giving us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do?
Yeah. So I've been drawing I think since I was 5 years old, maybe, and so it's drawing and painting has always been a part of my life, and has always been really a big part of my identity. From the time I was a young child, I always kind of thought of myself as an artist, or certainly my peers did, and maybe they applied it to me. But I continued to be really serious about drawing and painting all the way up through high school. And then into art school, I went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. Later, I went to graduate school at the New York Academy of Art. Um, I wasn't really intending to go into teaching necessarily, but I found out in graduate school that I had a real knack for doing it, because a lot of my peers would come to me for advice, for help. They'd ask me for critiques. They'd ask if they could, hang out in my studio and work on an assignment together. And I found myself in the role of teaching a lot, and I started hearing quite a lot that you're a really good teacher, and I thought, well, this would be a great way to support myself as a painter, but also give back. And I just really, all along the way, having been a student, an art student, for having been an art student for many years, I found that I really admired those teachers of mine, and I looked at the model of their life, where they were teaching a couple days a week, but then they were still painting really intensely, making paintings and having solo exhibitions. And I really liked that model. I really admired it. And I saw that that could be a path for myself. So as soon as I got out of graduate school at the New York Academy, I moved back to California, and I started this dual practice of being a painter and a professor, teacher, instructor, whatever you want to call it, of painting and drawing. And my life has been pretty consistent in that regard for the past 20 years. I've been called a professor, an instructor, a teacher, but also an exhibiting painter. And I like the balance. That's really come to define who I am as an artist. Um, I feel like as painters, we are always kind of in the role of being students, and then also finding ourselves in the role of being teachers. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. That covers, what, the first 40 years of my life there. So
Wow, then it's
most of
definitely a
it.
nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nutshell. Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's the quick answer.
Nice. Yeah, well, I think it's a great answer because I think it touches on something that not a lot of people consider, and that is how teaching is it can really change, not necessarily change, but it can help you grow a lot faster, especially if you already have a knack for it, right? Because when you teach something, you obviously have to know your subject twice as well than what you normally would. So I think for sure,
Yes.
if there's anyone out there who's hating on teaching as an artist, ooh, you're missing out because
Yeah.
it really
Yeah.
helps.
No, you're
Yeah.
you're spot on with that. You have to look way far ahead of any given lesson that you're teaching. You really have to know. You have to be proficient with the content much further down the road. Like if you're teaching
Yes.
A, B, and C, you have to be working on elemental PQ. Yourself. And
Exactly.
you're right. It forces you to look deeper into your subject, your career material.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think there's also this weird misconception about teaching artists aren't selling artists because of the whole like those who can't do teach, which obviously it's a lie. I have not met a
Right.
single, at least on the podcast. Every guest I've had has taught at least once,
That's
has
right.
done workshops, has done
Yeah.
maybe online courses. Like there's it's and they're all doing great and they're all selling. So I've seen
Yeah.
more proof of the opposite where
Yeah. Oh,
actually all the
yeah.
great artists teach.
Absolutely. And it goes back centuries. I mean, because, we look at all the great masters had students. In many cases, we're aware of who their students are and who they became. You could look at the Italian Renaissance when you had Andrea del Sarto brought in Pontormo, Pontormo brought in Bronzino. So, I mean, these are major names. It's not like they were students that were just forgotten. But I mean,
Mhm.
even looking at some of the greatest figure painters now, like Odd Nerdrum, who's very much in has a big role in teaching in his own way, and of
Mhm.
course is a legend as a painter himself. So
Yes,
it goes on and on. I think all of my favorite painters have or have had students. Yeah, so
absolutely.
I feel good about it. Yeah, and I do the same way. I go around talking to fledgling artists coming out of art school, and especially if they're about to obtain a master's degree, I say, put that degree to work for you, and let it create a salary that will support your painting career. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's really wise.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And even if, even for an artist that for example like me who came out of an atelier, not necessarily like a college, there are still schools that will take in,
oh yeah,
a
yeah,
teacher who
yeah,
maybe doesn't have a master's degree. Just putting
that's
it out
right.
there for anyone who's listening who's like, "Oh no, I can't do it." It's like, "No, yes, you can. You can."
Yes, you can.
um
Yeah, I agree.
yeah. Um, and in your nutshell, by the way, which is funny, I was actually going to ask you what your hero's journey was as an artist, but
Yeah.
if you want to say that, it's when you started painting at 5, then we could say it's that.
Yeah, well, I think the hero's journey for me started I was thinking about that, and I feel like it somewhere around the age of 16, I a lot of things started falling into place for me. I mean, when things about identity and who I was and who people saw me as, I think uh, that a lot of the artwork I was making as a teenager, they had themes to do with they were themes that had to do with searching, uh, going on a journey, finding some lost secret, and of course I'm just making these works as a kid, so they weren't like great artworks or anything, but they meant a lot to me at the time. And I think that going through that phase of just, who is my identity, learning that it is to be an artist, and of course that's just the beginning of the journey. It continued on and on, the act of finding oneself, through the pathway of being an artist. And that includes not just how you're looked at in the world by your immediate peers and friends and family, and then later, bigger audiences of people, but it also includes what your work is about. And that's I think for every artist, maybe that is the biggest aspect of their hero's journey is there's all these years of trials and tribulation that have to do with learning skill and technique to do the kind of work you want to do. But then once you have that, the big question, the big minotaur in the labyrinth that's facing you is, um, what do I paint? What's my subject matter? What are my themes? What am I saying through my artwork? I mean, that is a shadow, a monster. It's a dark inner, um, what's the word? An antagonist that we all have to face as artists in grappling with what are we going to do and say and depict in our artwork. So that was, that was for me a big part of the hero's journey. I think that connecting it to Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey, um, also for me around age 16. Well, even going back further, I mean, I had grown up with Star Wars from when it first came out. And I'm bringing in Star Wars because it has a strong affiliation with Joseph Campbell, who actually analyzed it in terms of the classical model of the hero's journey from Greek and Roman mythology. I grew up with Star Wars. I was born in 1976. So, I mean, my first memories were looking at the myth of Star Wars, and it stayed really strong with me. The whole idea of the mythos of Star Wars and appealed to me as a little kid, as a teenager, and I still love it. But I think when I was a teenager, I realized that one of the reasons why Star Wars appealed to me so much, even starting at a little tiny toddler age, were the themes of the hero's journey, and I really wanted I wanted the flavor of that, in a broader sense, to inhabit my work. Even if I wasn't cognizant of that when I was 16, but I became more so as I went through college, and I realized that it wasn't just this childhood um, interest in something that's cool with special effects and cinema, but it had a much bigger implications about psychology and mythology and philosophy, and and of course it really it's fun and entertaining, but it points the way to bigger historical things as well. So that was a big part of the process, just to reveal a little bit of my nerd side, in my love for Star Wars. But it's important. I think it's
Yeah.
important that we I think it's important for all artists to really look with seriousness at the things that excited you when you were young, and all along the way, and going back to your roots in your childhood, especially things that stuck with you in strong visual ways, and I think a lot of these things might be TV shows and movies, but they might just be family photographs that you grew up with, or it could be the cover of an album, or in images inside of the liner notes of an album that you loved when you were 12, 16, 21. Um, and though these things that sort of start to populate your visual memory, I think it's really important for artists at every stage of their development to go back and look at those things and say, why did that stick with me? Why did that leave such an impact? And if you can figure that out, I think that's a big part of our hero's journey in unraveling what our subject matter is and what our content is and why do we want to say those things? Why do we want to depict certain things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, and I think the you're touching on one of the fundamental things, which is, identity, right? Which you had
yeah,
mentioned how when you were 16, that's I mean, I feel like all adolescents, we all go through that who am I
yeah.
stage in our teens. But what's funny is, especially when you're an artist, it is even more important. Um, as I mean, in any form of arts, right? Be it acting, be it, music,
Hmm.
but in all the arts, especially for a creative career, really digging deep into the why and the who am I, right? And that's
Yeah.
actually one of my favorite questions to ask myself all the time because I've been reading a lot of books that are more like Eastern philosophy, and the question of who am I is something that is it's such a big part of especially Buddhism, for example,
Hmm.
because there really is a lot of unraveling that has to be done
Hmm.
in order to do what Jung would call shadow work, right? Which
Yeah,
is like trauma healing and disconnecting yourself from aspects of yourself that have gone rampant and are unconsciously destroying your life, right? So
yeah, yeah,
so fundamental for being a creative person to
yeah,
figure out what is holding me back, because truly it's so funny with my students. I have actually told them too, where when you're in front of a canvas and you're going to paint, you will be facing your demons. And I
yeah,
don't mean the demons in the canvas. I mean the demons in your head that are going to come
yeah,
out as you try to create. And I think, you really touched on that, which of course that hit a that hit a point, a special point for me, because it really is
yeah,
so important to look back, always look
yeah.
back to that child self and be like, who was stopping you? And how
Right.
do we allow this child self to come back out again without fear? Because
Yeah,
oh, that's really, ooh. I mean, it's like the
yeah,
hero, and when the hero returns home
yeah,
after learning their lessons, and they have to
yeah,
revisit that aspect of themselves,
yeah,
which
yeah.
very key, very, very key.
That's important work for an artist for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think that and that Joseph Campbell talked about the Theseus and the Minotaur story, and the very simple, elegant quote. I can't remember. Well, it's not so short, but it and the gist of it is that when we travel into the labyrinth, which is emblematic of delving into our own inner psyche, that ultimately when we find the monster at the core of the labyrinth that we're supposed to face as our enemy, we find out it's really just ourselves, and that's what's waiting for us. And the act of confronting that and acknowledging that and accepting that, that sort of unravels the whole problem right there.
Yeah,
And then we find the answers there. And there's also,
absolutely.
I think, a very similar. There's a similar metaphor Well, I grew up when I was young. I read Ursula K. Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea series, and
Mhm,
and there's a very sort of archetypal moment, Campbellian moment where
mm,
the protagonist of the story is running through the whole novel to escape the shadow that's chasing him that he
mm,
himself unleashed. And he spends most of the novel trying to get away from it, but then the moment he just stops and faces it, it undoes the whole problem. And I
mhm.
always loved that. That was a very profound moment in that story, and I think that fits in the Campbellian ideas of
Yeah,
shadow the hero's journey, but also of Jungian's shadow theory work, his shadow theory, his shadow work fits
Mhm.
that as well too. So yeah, I think about those two scholars, historians, philosophers, very much psychologists, I guess, with Jung, but um, those two concepts are really important for me: the Jungian shadow theory
Mhm.
and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Yeah, big
Yes.
important things for me in terms of figuring out my content on the canvas, but then also you feel it in yourself too. Why am I doing this? You know, and
Mhm.
you feel like you're doing that work and that you're on that journey, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that book, by the way. I also read it. I think about it, every so often. I just remember this wizard who has amazing power, creates this version of himself, runs away for years and years, and then, oh, you know what? I should just face it, and then everything's okay.
Yeah. There it
Think
is.
about
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I think about
Yeah.
that a lot.
It's
Um,
so important. Yeah.
it is, yeah, and then to nerd out just a little bit, there is actually another movie that also talks about or, there is that self-identification of, the protagonist and the real enemy, which is obviously himself, or seeing the truth behind who they really are, and that is actually in The Neverending Story. I don't know if you watched
Mm.
it,
Oh
where
yeah.
Atreyu, he's going through, the snow and the ice, and he sees a mirror and he
Hmm.
actually sees the truth in the mirror, which is that he is actually a character in a book. But it doesn't really hit him. Which that immediately when you said the Minotaur being, the main character, I just imagine that scene because it stuck with me. Because that's one of the
That
movies that really
is.
stuck with me.
Oh yeah, I know it very too well, and that's a pivotal, iconic moment, I think, in in any kind of hero's journey tradition,
Mhm,
and and then of course he confronts the monster that's been chasing him, the wolf, the
mhm,
and and sort of willing to in the act of slaying the wolf, he's willing to die himself too, and sort of become one with his enemies. Like, he says, I'd rather die fighting, and they kind of embrace each other.
mhm.
And there's this willingness to just become one with your shadow, even if it destroys you in that sense, in that example.
Mhm.
But he survives, of course, and
Yeah.
he comes out renewed after that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think the shadow work for the artist, and I think for me, for my own particular experience with Jung's shadow work, is that it's been an interesting experience because when I started out leaving art school and figuring out what my paintings were going to be like, and what subject matter and how was I going to deal with form and light. I was very much driven by Caravaggio's use of light and shadow, and which comes from a Renaissance Baroque um, treatment of light and shadow, which is really quite simple. That light is divine, and shadow is just a void, or you can say it's evil, or it's the lack of God, or it's the dark side of human existence. And so a lot of my paintings, and even still to this day, I think I try to work with that Caravaggesque understanding of light and shadow, where everything good and interesting is in the light, the colors in the light, the detail, the form, um, the thicker, more robust paint is in the light, and then the shadows are all the opposite. They're the void, they're earth tone, so lacking in color. They're transparent. They're thinner areas of the painting. I mean, I love that. But then more recently, as I've thought more about what Jung has to say about the shadow and what does that mean for artists. Um, and I mean, the gist of Jung's shadow principle is that the more we look into our shadows, we find really important lessons for ourselves, to learn about ourselves. And I thought, what does that mean about me as a painter if I'm only looking at what's in the light? And it's changing the way that I paint now, where I still come at it from this very, very historical solution that light is the brilliant divine thing and shadow is this absence. But I find that the Jung's shadow theory is causing me to embrace painting in different ways, that there is a lot to be shown in the shadow and that we need to look into it and delve into it. And does that mean that I need to depict it more in the painting? Does that mean that I need to start thinking about different systems of light? Because I've always worked with the Caravaggio-esque light, where it's a super strong, concentrated, narrow beam of light, whether that's from a portal in the window or if it's, it's a light bulb. I've always created that kind of singular light source, light, stark. Like Caravaggio's paintings look like we're just seeing something happening that's lit up by a flash of lightning in the black space, and that's exciting. But I'm starting to think more and more as a painter these days that I want to investigate other lighting systems. Like I have a painting, it's actually behind me on the easel, but the figures are, well, there's one figure who's brightly illuminated, and there's other figures that are in the shadows, like they're literally inside the shadows. And I've never painted that before. I've never fully resolved form in a painting that's inside of the shadow. And I think that I'm doing that now because, the more I think about Jung's shadow theory, the more I feel like that is important to work with. And I think this also spills forward into our content that we create and the content that we choose for ourselves, because it totally ties in to Jung's shadow theory, where if we say, this is what I paint, like I paint this, this, and this, these are my stories. And then someone might say to you, well, why don't you paint this and this? And you'd say, oh, I don't do that. Well, right there, when you say I don't do that, you just put that in the bag. Jung has an analogy of the bag, or at least a lot of Jungian psychologists have the metaphor of the bag to explain his shadow concept. We've got this sack, this bag with us, and from the time we're 5, we start putting things in the sack. Like I'm not supposed to hit my brother. Okay, I'll put that in the sack. I'm not supposed to hoard the toys to myself. Okay, I'll put that in the sack. But then later on, things like, we might be in grade school. We might think, well, I don't wear those kind of sneakers. I wear these kind of sneakers. So that goes in the sack, And later in college, like, oh, I don't cut my hair like that. I cut my hair like this because I have this style. I don't have that style. So all that thing or that style that I don't have, that goes in the sack. And all those things are now in your shadow. And they're going to haunt you the rest of your life. And so if I go around saying, oh, I paint these kinds of subject matters, I don't paint those ones over there. That's not me. Well, now that's in my shadow. And it's a problem. It's something that we have to constantly look at. And, if we go around painting in a certain way, the things that we're not painting, we have to not ignore those things. So I find that Jung's shadow theory has affected me both in literal ways in terms of thinking about light and shadow as a painter, but also in terms of how I think about content, and what the content is I choose for myself. I'm constantly questioning now. Is this something that I'm supposed to be doing because it's out here in my psyche, in my conscious psyche, or what about all the stuff that's in my subconscious that I've subverted? That's really where the haunting, fermented, rich feelings actually are. And I don't want to lose touch with that, because that's where the gold is, as they say in Jungian traditions. It's really gold if you can pull what's out of the shadow in a healthy way, of course. Like when we're, the first lesson we learn when we're 3 and 5 is don't hit your sibling, don't hit your brother or your sister. Well, that's good. That should be in the sack and it should stay there. But there's a lot of stuff later. Like I said, I don't cut my hair like this, or I don't wear that kind of shirt. Some of that stuff is, if we stick with it, we're not really discovering who our true selves are. And then it comes out inadvertently later. It comes out it's going to emerge, it'll emerge in, who you pick as your friends and who you pick as your spouse and so forth. Yeah. So anyway, that goes down a rabbit hole tunnel of
Yeah,
those
it
traditions.
does, but It's a great rabbit hole though, and I've gone down it quite often because,
Yeah, yeah,
it's like you're saying, right? It's like instead of being like, I don't do that, it's like, why? Why don't I do that? Why
right,
don't I explore this thing that creates this reaction in me? It's like, why do I even, because there's like half of the stuff that's happening around you, half of the things that you see, it's like, I don't care. But what about those things that have that
yeah,
little trigger, whether it's a good one or a
yeah,
bad one, right? That
right,
there's like there's triggers, and I read somewhere online that people are calling like the good ones glimmers, where it's like, ah, I really love how this
mm,
painting is speaking to me, or I really love
mm,
how the colors are moving in this image, right? That's like a
mm-hmm,
glimmer. That's like, okay, that's something to also explore that could
yeah,
have been in the shadows as well.
yeah,
And the other great point that you make is how the shadow actually has gifts. And we were talking about this
oh
before
yeah,
we went on the podcast, how the shadow has these gifts
yeah,
that help you. It's almost like a breadcrumb trail, which
mm-hmm,
when you are vulnerable to yourself, because obviously, it's hard to do that with strangers, but when you are
yeah,
vulnerable with yourself and you face yourself in that, I am my own enemy type of way,
mm-hmm,
it really is, it can be a place full of compassion that leads you to an even deeper level of understanding of yourself, and
mm-hmm,
therefore a better understanding of why you even do what you do as an artist,
right,
which, whew,
yeah,
I think we could even do another episode just talking about this subject because it
yeah,
is, it's so fundamental to the creative practice.
yeah,
Um, but I did want to ask you, since we're talking
mm-hmm.
about narrative and Jung and the hero's journey, I wanted to ask you how you approach storytelling in your art, and if there are any recurring mythological elements that you frequently explore.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, because I love the narrative in traditional painting, realism, representational painting, whatever you want to call it. That's always been my biggest inspiration. Even just from looking at storybooks and illustrations as a child, and later reading all of the classics that were illustrated by N.C. Wyeth. Um, so I have a strong love for the narrative, but I think traditional illustrators like N.C. Wyeth, like Norman Rockwell, Howard Pyle, who I regard as masters. Um, they I think the role of the illustrator is to give the story in a more straightforward way, but they don't always do it that way. I mean, sometimes they just they illustrate the story being told, because that's their role. They're an illustrator. Their image accompanies a novel or a story of some kind. I like it, for me, I like it when there's a piece of the narrative is there, but there's also a mystery waiting to be investigated or solved by the viewer, or maybe it's never solved. Maybe it leaves them with the feeling of mystery. I think that's important, to leave the viewer with either a mild or strong dose of mystery to the work, even if the painter has a specific intention in mind in what they're doing and what narrative they're telling. Um, that's where my interest in narrative artwork falls. I think a lot about dreams and how dreams are narratives of types, but dreams are fascinating narratives because they can take a sudden left turn, or they can have multiple outcomes, or the narrative can change, but and yet still feel cohesive with its initial story. I mean, dreams can be wild and crazy, and a lot of people discount them, but I think a lot of artists look at their dreams very seriously. Um, so for me, when I make narrative paintings, I think about dreams a lot, because something that I think is true, something I feel is true about dreams is that it makes sense that this is true to me, because it's happening in your mind, happening in your brain when you have a dream. Everything that happens in that dream, everybody that you encounter and interact with, is really just you wearing a disguise or a mask or a different outfit or cloaked in, the skins of another animal or a monster. Um, and so when we make a painting, a multiple figure narrative painting, we're really tapping into that flavor of a dream where we're playing all these roles, and we're looking at all these different aspects of our own persona. And then we're asking our viewer to do the same, of course, because I don't think narrative painting is about the painter themselves. It shouldn't be. I don't think narrative painting, I think we don't want to create the impression that an artist is really just narcissistic and completely engaged in their own neuroses. I think it's important for an artist to work with all of these themes and traditions, the Jungian one, the Campbellian one, um, but to realize that there's a duty when making narrative art to always pull the audience in, to make it powerful for them, to say, well, let's say this painting embraces or grapples with issues of abandonment or rejection in some way, or maybe that leads into topics of isolation. um, it's important for the artist to say, even though they've experienced that themselves in their own life, to not make it a soap opera painting about the exact way in which they've experienced it, but to really zoom out in the narrative and say, how can I deal with themes of rejection, isolation, abandonment? I'm just picking ones at random, right? Big human themes.
Mhm.
Um, that will pull in the whole audience. Everyone that's going to look at this can find a way in to resonate with what's going on in the story, in the painting, or the characters and what they're doing in the painting, to find a way to see themselves in the painting. I think for me, narrative artworks, really they have that, um, they have that, what's the word, that requirement, that they need that accountability to speak to the audience, to pull in the audience. And we don't need to give them a scripted version of what's happening in the painting. A mysterious version of what's happening is really better, because it just tickles human intrigue more. But it also might leave um, openings or seats in the audience for the audience to feel, for the individual viewer to feel like they can now inhabit and be part of the audience, be part of or really take part in the performance of what's happening, feel like they're
Mhm.
in there. I hope and strive for those feelings in my painting. I'm not saying that I can do that or that I always do that. I think I do it sometimes when I'm lucky, but I always think about it, and that's something I want to have happen in my paintings. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great goal, and I like the point that you make about the viewer being, the person who didn't make it being the part that completes the cycle of painting. Because of course we don't, yeah, to an extent we paint for ourselves, but that doesn't mean that what we're painting exists in a void, right? There are people out there
right,
who will resonate with it heavily, even if they
right.
weren't the ones who created it. I mean, it's the same reason we all fall in love with movies like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, because,
Hmm.
it touches something for
Yeah,
some people. And
yes,
Star Wars as well, for that matter.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I really wanted to know too, in your personal hero's journey, what was it like for you to go from student to full-fledged, you know, artist living from their work? What was that like? And do you have any advice for someone looking to do the same?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question, and I hear it a lot, because especially from art students leaving school, the big question is, how am I going to all kinds of things? How am I going to support myself? How am I going to get my work out there? That's a big one.
Yep.
And of course, what we've been talking about, what should I paint? Sometimes that is a big question for somebody. They've acquired all this skill in their training, and then what do they paint? And And sometimes there's not a lot of room in there for variation to paint and be unique, and stand out from your peers in a special way. So for me, I left graduate school and I started to teach right away, and the income that brought in really bought me time in the studio to start to explore. And not all of it is very glorious. Like I'll say, my first years out of grad school, I really wanted to secure a gallery and to have a relationship with the gallery and to have the gallery like me and be in support of my work. And so I found that what was sort of safe and sanctioned by a lot of galleries was to paint still life. And I don't think there's any shame in painting still life at all. And I honestly, I love painting still life, and I did so for many years. And I think I'm really good at it. I did a lot of still life when I first got out of graduate school. So I'm getting into the answer here. And I would show those in galleries, and they would sell. I think that painting still life for a gallery is a great way to really push yourself in your skills, your chops, the technical aspects of your painting, because you can try out all kinds of subject matter. I mean, of course, you start with bowls of fruit, but you might find yourself painting really challenging things, like a big tangle of branches or something, or drapery that's knotted and tangled and convoluted with other things wrapped up in it. And you could really challenge yourself with all the different kinds of subject matter that can be painted, and test yourself in that regard. And of course, you have a lot of time and space and privacy to do that when you paint still life. You can take all the time you want to sit in front of that still life table, and no one's looking over your shoulder. There's no model waiting to take a break or to be paid and so forth. So still life was a good friend of mine. As an early painter. And I think that ended up spilling out into painting interiors, painting hallways and rooms and looking through doorways into kitchens with beautiful light and space. And there's a wonderful tradition of interiors where there are no figures, and yet they're full of mood and feeling, and they really test the painter's ability to paint light and space and perspective and atmosphere. I did a lot of interiors, and um, somewhere along the way, I think I found stability. I think fairly early on, I found stability in a combination of teaching and painting still life. I will say that I knew that the whole time I was really pleasing the gallery. I showed with John Pence Gallery in San Francisco for 14 years, and John was a wonderful dealer. He's still alive, but he's retired now in his 80s, and wonderful support and dealer, and had an incredible gallery in San Francisco full of a lot of contemporary realists that are still working. And it was a wonderful community too. But John really wanted me to paint a lot of still life, and he would often tell his newer painters that were just joining the stable of artists at the gallery, he'd say, I want you to paint me a show of 30 still lifes, and they can be small, but I want them, all to be very cohesive, similar lightings. I want you to frame them all the same way, and we'll give you your first solo show. And I think that was a formula that worked for a lot of painters. I think they were able to kind of enter the scene with something that seemed really well unified and coordinated in its appearance. A lot of it would sell, and that would sound good to the world that this painter is selling. But pretty quickly after doing that, I felt that this is not what I dreamed for myself. What did I dream about doing? And of course, I looked up, I thought about painters that really excited me, and those were Velasquez and Caravaggio and Odd Nerdrum and Membo Bartlett and Vincent Desiderio. These were painters that I saw their work that were doing large paintings with multiple figures that had a narrative of some kind. And that's what really made me go through all the training and the study. And I thought that I'm going to do that one day. I think it's important for an artist to call it when they feel like they've kind of had that transitional period out of school, solidified what kind of techniques they use, how they paint, what their paintings kind of look like, the palette they use. Are they direct painters? Are they indirect painters? I mean, do they just do mostly alla prima? Do they like to do a lot of glazing? They have to figure that stuff out. And I think that can be done in that sort of fledgling period when you leave the nest of the art school. And that's why still life is a great thing. Um, but there's an important moment to stop being the fledgling and really start to soar high. Like that was the goal, is I wanted to soar way up there in the clouds, if we're using a bird analogy, leaving the nest. And that can be scary too, because you wonder, am I going to stop selling? Are the galleries going to start to kind of not want to show my work because they're bigger and they might be weird, they might be scary, they might embrace grotesque theme. Galleries start to go, about that. That's a challenge that the artist can face as they start to leave that fledgling stage of being an artist, a new artist, and start to move into their more mid-career, maybe. They might find that if they're being true to themselves in the artwork they want to make, that really what inspired them in the first place, they might also find it's not easy to sell or to show. And there's a trade-off there. And hopefully you've got the stability financially that maybe you can afford not to sell a little bit while your work goes through this new coming out of a cocoon phase, where you're really going to be the more mature painter that you will become. And there's big trade-offs, because while you're really nurturing your dream and your vision, and you're following that passion that you always saw for yourself, you might also be suffering in other ways. All the things I mentioned, not selling, galleries maybe treating you with a little bit of an aversion because your work is big and takes up a lot of wall space. If you make big paintings that take up a lot of wall space, galleries, and I don't blame them, they're not really going to like that, because they have very expensive rents to pay. I can sympathize with a gallery in New York City or San Francisco or Los Angeles. They have to have a space in a very affluent part of town with a lot of traffic so that people will see the work. They need to be available to clients that have a lot of money, that are interested in collecting artwork. They have very challenging rents. If we could see those figures, we would kind of be horrified. And then when you present them with the idea of showing a large, challenging painting of yours that has, things that are not necessarily pleasant or happy to put on your wall at home, that take up the entire wall of that room in the gallery, they're going to sort of be nervous, because there goes their rent for the month. Whereas if you give them 30 still lives, they're pretty happy, because even if they sell 10 of those, then they're okay. They're in good shape.
Yeah.
So that is some tricky territory for the fledgling artist becoming the mature painter to have to navigate. And that's kind of, maybe that's where I find myself nowadays. It's embracing the work that I really wanted to do and doing it and feeling good about that. But understanding that it's going to be harder to show my work because of its size. These paintings behind me are much more moderately sized. They're like around 40 inches square-ish, or in that size range. But I just completed a painting that's 9 feet tall by 7 feet wide. And that's hard to exhibit, and it's also hard to find a home for it. Even if I found the past couple paintings I've done that have been that scale, a lot of people do want them, but the reality is they can't fit them in their houses, apartments, or even if they can, this has been a real heartbreaker. Even if they can fit them in their apartments, if let's say you have an affluent collector in New York City who wants to own your large painting and they can fit it in their apartment, they live in, an older pre-war Upper East Side apartment in Manhattan, and there actually is no freight elevator, and the stairwells up into the building are tiny, and they can barely fit their couches up into their
Mhm.
buildings.
Mhm.
And they realized that after taking some measurements, this has happened to myself and a couple of my colleagues. After taking some measurements, they realized the painting won't fit up the stairwell, and there is no elevator to fit it in, and they just can't have the purchase. So that's a challenge. We want to make these big, exciting paintings that we see on the walls in the Met, in the Prado. We want to do that work,
Yeah.
but it doesn't always fit. Very
No.
simply fit. It doesn't fit. A very close friend of mine and a painter I admire just did a really large painting in New York, and she had a buyer for it. And the buyer really found out that it was an inch or 2 inches too wide to fit between the windows in the apartment, and so they declined the sale. So this is something I think for us to think about is we want to do these big, exciting paintings, a lot of us, but we also need to like figure out how big can I go? How big can I go? And it'll still fit into an apartment or a house or up a stairwell or up an elevator that's maybe not a freight elevator. We kind of have to think about some of these questions. They're not always fun. I mean, when we look at Odd Nurjum's paintings, he doesn't worry about that. I mean, he paints ginormous paintings, and
Yes.
he figures it out later.
He does.
Uh,
Yeah. And in the end, he doesn't really do it for anyone else, but obviously himself, which is first and foremost. And he
yeah.
does have collectors. I mean, there is I forget what maybe it's called the Seven Bridges, up in
Yes.
like upstate New York.
They're in Connecticut. Yeah.
Oh, Connecticut. There you go.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
way like above. I remember I really wanted to visit because it's these huge Odd Nerdrum paintings, and they're all just hanging in
Yeah.
one place. It's like the only other place
Yeah.
you'll ever see that is at Odd Nerdrum's studio. Um, so it's if anyone's out there, I definitely recommend checking it out. But I
Yeah.
agree, yeah. And you know what? But like, what if you can like unstretch the painting and then restretch it
Yeah.
in that person's
Yeah.
house?
Yeah, I think that's something that is a very good point, and I think painters need to be prepared to do that. That offering to unstretch and restretch. Um, I think I haven't done that enough, and I think I have a real aversion to restretching paintings. And I should really just get over it. And I've a lot of my heroes. I think everyone says it's not something you really want to do, but you do it if you have to. Is unstretch a painting, roll it, and restretch it on location, whether it's because
Yeah.
of shipping logistics or just fitting it into a person's apartment.
Yes.
I think painters should be prepared to stretch and unstretch and restretch paintings to learn how to do that well,
Mhm.
in a way that doesn't damage the painting. It's tricky. I mean, I think to restretch a painting that's been painted and unstretched, to do it well that doesn't damage the painting. I mean, you need a big space to do it.
Yeah.
You need a huge warehouse with lots of room around you. You can't be in a confined room. You
Mhm.
need a lot of table space to get that painting elevated. That table needs to be, a really smooth, clean table without any,
Clean.
no nails sticking out of it or anything like that. So you do need some resources to restretch and do it well.
Mm.
It's not always so straightforward. And
Oh,
then, restretching it inside of an apartment and to do it well where the canvas is really taut and tight and not,
yeah.
misaligned with its stretcher bars. That really, I have nightmares about that. I really do. I really don't want to do that. But I
Mhm.
suppose if it comes down to finding a home for the painting, then it has to be done. But
Yep.
I have nightmares about somebody paying a large amount of money for a major painting that you've done and then not being able to restretch it well and giving them a compromised product. It creates a lot of anxiety in me as a painter.
Oh, no, I totally get that.
So
And you make some very good
yeah,
points. I just thought like,
yeah,
maybe if it's like slightly too big for a stairwell, and maybe it can be restretched in a
yes,
good
it
enough
could,
area, but yeah,
it could, yeah,
50-50 chance.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that. 50-50.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I just feel bad for the collector because if they really, they really wanted it, and especially if it's a big painting that they had been considering for a while, it's like,
Yeah,
oh, to not be able to
it's a
go through with it,
tragedy.
it's
It's a
painful.
tragedy for everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. At BoldBrush, we inspire artists to inspire the world because creating art creates magic, and the world is currently in desperate need of magic. BoldBrush provides artists with free art marketing, creativity, and business ideas and information. This show is an example. We also offer written resources, articles, and a free monthly art contest open to all visual artists. We believe that fortune favors the bold brush. And if you believe that too, sign up completely free at boldbrushshow.com. That's BoldBrush show.com. The BoldBrush Show is sponsored by FASO. Now more than ever, it's crucial to have a website when you're an artist, especially if you want to be a professional in your career. Thankfully, with our special link, faso.com/podcast, you can make that come true and also get over 50% off your first year on your artist website. Yes, that's basically the price of 12 lattes in 1 year, which I think is a really great deal considering that you get sleek and beautiful website templates that are also mobile friendly, e commerce, print on demand in certain countries, as well as access to our marketing center that has our brand new art marketing calendar. And the art marketing calendar is something that you won't get with our competitor. The art marketing calendar gives you day by day, step by step guides on what you should be doing today, right now, in order to get your artwork out there and seen by the right eyes so that you can make more sales this year. So, if you want to change your life and actually meet your sales goal this year, then start now by going to our special link, faso.com/podcast. That's FASO.com/podcast.
yeah,
But on a brighter note, I did want to ask you about the
yeah,
exhibition that you helped curate, Big
yes,
Stories. Can you tell us about that?
yes. Well, I'm very proud about that. Big Stories is it's a big dream come true. Really, it's an exhibition of multi painter exhibition of 18 different painters that I helped co-curate alongside my colleagues and friends, Carl Dobsky, who's a wonderfully impressive painter, and Carl and I went to grad school together in New York. And we also worked with Bo Bartlett is a co-curator as well. And Big Stories started out actually is it 6 or 7 years back, and I found emails going all the way back to 2017, in which Carl and I discussed the challenges of making big multi-figure narrative paintings and where do we exhibit them? And wouldn't it be nice if there was a show or an exhibition that celebrated this kind of work where we could bring the whole community together of artists that are working in this tradition and everyone gets to show together in a big show. And it sounded like a fantasy at first. Um, Pretty quickly we felt that we should approach Bo Bartlett because he was a mutual hero of both mine and Carl's. And of course, Bo had a major tradition in his own work of working in this tradition, this historical practice of large multi-figure paintings. He also had a center in Columbus, Georgia, where he grew up, called the Bo Bartlett Center, which was a really top-notch exhibition space, a huge space for exhibiting painting shows. And so we sought out Bo for his guidance on curating a show because we have never done it before. And Bo is 20 years our senior, and he's been a very successful painter. And of course, the Bo Bartlett Center we thought would be supportive to staging this exhibition. So Bo was immediately very supportive and interested in joining us as a curator and interested in staging the exhibition at the Bo Bartlett Center. And for the next a couple of years, I mean, this was back in 2017 and 2018 when Bo joined us as a curator. For the next several years, we talked about artists that we would like to have in the show and what paintings we would like to have in the show by them. And it took a lot of work to not only approach the painters and get them to commit to being in the show, In many cases, several of the artists wanted to make new paintings for the show, and so they needed a lot of time to make a large, impressive work that was exhibition worthy. They needed a big heads up to do that. Um, and and just a lot of time in dealing with the logistics of loaning paintings that were either owned by a collection like the Seven Bridges Foundation that you mentioned, or the Stephen Bennett collection. A lot of negotiating with them on what paintings would be loaned and what the agreement was. So we learned that curating is it's a lot of logistical work, in
Mhm.
working with independent um, owners of paintings and collections and museums. One case we owned a painting by Amy Sherrill from the Baltimore Museum of Art. We loaned several paintings from the Seven Bridges Foundation, and I mentioned the Stephen Bennett collection. We owned we excuse me we loaned paintings from Black Art in America, which is a foundation that supports black painters, black artists in Atlanta, Georgia. So it was a lot of logistical work. Fortunately, we had the support of the staff from the Bo Bartlett Center, including the director at the Bo Bartlett Center, Michael McFalls, and his staff. They were incredibly instrumental in helping us make big stories a reality. So after 6 years of planning and logistical work and loan forms and um, corresponding with artists, we finally were able to put together this world class exhibition, um, and it opened up at the Bo Bartlett Center in early October, and it's still up now. This is We're in fall 2023 as we're talking, and so the show is still up there now, and it's going to run through December 16th of 2023, and then we're all very excited because it's going to travel. The show will travel to the New York Academy of Art, and will be exhibited there from January 26th through March 3rd, 2024. So the opening reception is going to be January 26th, which is a Friday, at the New York Academy of Art in Manhattan. So all the work is getting ready soon. We've got a couple more weeks here, but it's getting ready to travel. And the exhibit will open up in New York, and we'll all go out for it. There's going to be an artist panel discussion. Um, we've talked about Odd Nerdrum a couple times in our conversation here. We have one of his paintings in the show. We tried to fill up the show with a lot of our heroes, Odd being one of them, Bo Bartlett and Vincent Desiderio being others. Margaret Boland is a hero, and she has a painting in the show. And a lot of contemporary heroes too, like Zoe Frank and Michelle Dahl and Aaliyah Chapin. So a lot of fantastic realists, both from the older generation, the mid generation, the newer generation. It's very exciting to get all of us together and to promote work of this nature again. To say, hey, this is something that should be done, and it's an exciting way to be an artist, to make paintings in this tradition, and we should, if it's something that calls to you as an artist, which I think if you're a figurative realist, it probably does, because you've looked at a lot of painters and been inspired by a lot of painters who paint in that tradition, and from Rembrandt to Caravaggio to Velázquez to Rubens. These are all probably painters that you've looked at and admired, and they work in these big, large scale traditions with lots of figures and a narrative going on. It probably is something that calls to you if you find yourself in that category, and it's something that you should strive for. And it's not always easy. There's a lot of constraints, like finding a studio space to do that in, finding a place that will exhibit the work, but it should be done nonetheless, I think.
I agree completely. Also
Yeah,
because I'm very biased towards making big paintings because that's also my goal.
yeah.
But yeah, that is so cool. I wish I could go. Um Unfortunately, I can't
Oh,
really afford to do that at the moment. Um but uh hopefully eventually in the future I can, go out there and see some of the more I guess, contemporary narrative paintings that are out there in the realism world, because it's really awesome to see how, like in the 80s, right? Realism was considered dead, dead and
Yeah.
gone, buried,
Right.
you know?
Right.
So it's so amazing to now be in a time where it's back. It was never gone.
Yes.
All of these incredible people who, lived through the 20th century, who were able to, hold on so tight to this information
Yeah.
on, painting in the traditional sense because it was, oh my God, I've heard so many horror stories about how we have lost certain information, right? But what we were
Yes.
able to
Yeah.
hold on to, now it's coming back and it's so
Right.
inspiring. So
It
I'm happy
is.
that,
It's really.
you decided to make this exhibition happen because that's
Thank
oh,
you.
it's such a
Yeah.
testament to this rebirth.
It's been a dream come true to have this show become a reality, and also to get to be a part of it. I mean, I have a painting in the show. Carl Dobsky has a painting in the show, and of course, Bo Bartlett has a painting in the show with the three curators. We want to be a part of it too, so we curated ourselves in to get to be in that company. Like you said, it realism, traditional figuration. Using the figure in a classical manner, as you said. It really dwindled down to just a handful of practitioners through those mid-century years, the 60s, 70s, 80s. There were barely any still
Mhm,
doing it. And then certainly they were pushed way into the shadows and they weren't given any attention by art critics and so forth. So, but they maintained the practice and it's this kind of slowly came back up out of the subconsciousness of the collective subconsciousness of art. It's bubbled its way back to the surface.
mhm,
Um, that's why I named Bo Bartlett and Vincent Desiderio. They were two painters that really in the 80s they suddenly had a solo show, or it was a group show together with some other painters that it really caught attention, in the early 80s that, oh, people are doing this again. They weren't the ones that, necessarily the ones that carried it through. Other painters like Sidney Goodman, who taught at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, was one. Ben Kamihura, also taught at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. I mean, they were doing realism, traditional figuration through the 60s and 70s, um, and just keeping that thread alive. And others that ended up becoming more connected with the Atelier movement, like Ted Seth Jacobs and Michael Aviano, they were doing the work at that time. And they were these little seeds that then took on a handful of students, and those students then have blossomed into these ateliers that are all over the world now.
mhm,
And using traditional classical methods of drawing and painting, it suddenly becoming available for artists everywhere. Because what was never lost was an interest in seeing artwork
mhm.
of that nature. I
Yeah.
mean, you would go to the museums and it wouldn't, and the galleries, and it wouldn't really be available. And the cool people, the hip people, they were fine with it. But the general world was going around saying, why don't people paint like the old masters anymore? And when I go to the museum, that's what I want to see. And so they would go to the museum and they would be fulfilled in that way. But they were
Mhm,
wondering, the world was wondering what happened to the realists and why doesn't anybody work in that manner anymore? And it's suddenly your generation, especially. It's really surprising how technically skilled. I think thanks to the availability of atelierism, um, incredibly skilled and just impressive, you've all become. And I said earlier when we were just warming up, talking before the interview, um, that I think it's important for artists of my generation and older to keep our eyes on you guys because um, we don't want to fall out of touch, and we don't want to uh, to lose the connection to the new and what's happening now, and staying relevant, and making sure that our work is connected to it in some way. I think it's important that we don't just closet ourselves and say, I'm only going to think about what my teachers did and what they told me. That's important too, but also to look at the younger generations to see what's happening um, and keep a connection with it, keep our eye on it, and learn from it. I learn a lot from it. I think thanks to social media, I'm able to see what a lot of new fledgling realists are doing, and it pushes me. I see really good things, impressive things, things that make me realize I still have to keep pushing myself, and that's exciting. It keeps you energized and alive, and still trying to pull more out of yourself, to be better, to strive harder. That's what the younger generation can provide for artists that are in their mid-career, like myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks to you guys and all that you're doing, and how you're keeping us inspired and motivated.
Yeah, and thanks to you guys too for, holding the torch and continuing that legacy of narrative multifigural painting because again, like when I was in high school, I thought it was no one does that. I want to do that, but no one does that until I found out that ateliers existed
Right.
by chance. Because I met someone who happened to study in my high school, and he had studied in an atelier, and I was like, "Hold on,
Hmm.
wait, what?" Like he had already
Hmm.
graduated and stuff, and I was just a kid. So
Yeah.
when I was like, "Wait a minute, people still paint like that? You're kidding!"
Right.
Like I was
Right.
so mind blown and excited because I was taking art history, and I was just like, I wanna paint like Rubens, I wanna paint like all of these, old dead dudes that like, why don't we do that anymore, you know? So it's good to know that there
Good
are
question.
living people who do it. Um,
Yeah.
so it really is inspiring also for my generation. So it's a
and
back and
for
forth
and
thing.
for yeah, exactly, but and for women too, because when you look at art history, it's mostly loaded full of, like you said, dead
Dead
white
dudes.
dudes, and there are some women like Artemisia Gentileschi
Mhm.
and Vigie Lebrun, and it gets better as you go into the 19th century, like Rosa Bonheur and
Oh, she's
Cecilia
amazing.
Beau and Mary Cassatt is like, but when you go back into the Renaissance and the Baroque, not so much. I mean, we kind of only have like Artemisia.
Mhm.
But I think that some of the most impressive realists now are women. And, some of my favorite realists like Mamaya Gurpide and Colleen Barry, I mean, blow me away. And
Mhm.
I constantly look at their work and find inspiration in it. So that's exciting too, to bring women into the whole
Mhm.
tradition of it, and
Yes.
not just like in a token way, like, oh, we got to have the women. It's like, no, you guys are really becoming the heavy hitters, and I really
Mhm.
mean that, and so that's really important because it's much better. Everything's much better when
Yeah.
it's balanced with all of us. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Also because, there's like the rite of passage that women go through that men don't and vice versa. We have these differences in vision and in experience in life that, like you said, it completes also the narrative of, people as humanity, so
Yeah.
it's also good to see that that's happening.
Yeah.
More female role models out there, which is also amazing.
So good. Yeah, I love it. I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I did want to ask you, because of course on this podcast we do touch upon marketing. And
Yes.
something that I find fascinating is that not a lot of people, or yeah, I guess not a lot of people really realize that a lot of marketing is actually narrative. Um, when you're selling something, you're not just selling the thing, you're selling a story, you're selling like the entire experience of whatever it is that you're selling, right? In this case, painting. How do you use narrative when it comes to marketing your work?
That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that before. Um, I think that I try to identify myself as a narrative artist, as a narrative painter, um, and the works, the descriptions of the shows, and the descriptions of the works within the shows tend to discuss that as really tying into a tradition, tying into a history of this practice. and identifying myself as a classical narrative figurative artist that is using painting techniques that come from the traditions of certain figureheads in art history, like Caravaggio, like Rembrandt, and so forth. Um, I think, just in descriptions of shows, I think that it would be limited to that in how I describe the paintings in the show. Um, Marketing the work, I think, has changed a lot since the advent of social media. I'm sure we all agree. It's been a wonderful thing for artists to have social media, to be able to take something that's just a sketch or an idea, and in a few moments, a little scribble or an oil sketch or a half finished drawing or a painting that's just the underpainting, anything can be shared with the world in just a matter of seconds. And the fulfillment, the satisfaction that we get from that, I think is so major, because I remember years where um, we couldn't market ourselves that way, to say, this is what I'm doing. I'm an artist who's working right now in this moment on my easel. This is what it looks like. Here I am painting, or this is what I'm struggling with. And to just share that with the world. Before the advent of social media, artists felt, I think, very lonely and isolated. And often there was this metaphor of the artist chained to their easel that was shared around a lot. I'd hear painters, realists especially, say they felt chained to the easel in a lonely, windowless room somewhere, because they couldn't afford to have a studio. So they'd be in their basement and just painting a still life, and the hours and hours that went into it. And you would sit there and paint, trying to finish this painting, because you knew that that would be where you'd get to actually see the world again, is putting the painting out there in a gallery or in a show. And so you were kind of waiting for that moment to get the fulfillment, the reward of your craft, to get to share what you've done with the world. And it was very frustrating to say, well, this painting's not going to be done for months. No one's going to know about it unless they happen to visit my studio. And even after it's finished, it'll be months before it's exhibited. And you really had to wait for the gallery to market it. Well, now you can market it yourself, because we all have Instagram accounts and other social media as well. Instantaneously, you get to share the making of it, the stages of it, and the unveiling of it when it's done. And I think the artists don't feel so lonely anymore in their marketing. They also don't feel beholden to a gallery to manage the marketing, or even the necessity to have a really strong website. I mean, that's imperative, I think, to have a strong website. But the access to social media changes the marketing quite a bit, because you can make any post, you can turn any post into, it could just be about sharing the work, but it could also be that this is what I do in the workshop that I'm teaching this summer. Or it could be that, I'm having a studio sale this summer of all the drawings that I've been doing as studies for my next big painting. Here they are. And, I'm going to begin selling them next week. And so it's instantaneous marketing that I think it puts a lot of power back in the hands of the artist. And it's that instantaneousness of it feels very powerful, that I can just be drawing on the easel or painting on the wall over here and decide, oh, I better market my show coming up next month. And I don't have to wait for the gallery to do it. I can do it myself. That's been a wonderful thing. On the downside of that, I often worry that we've put so much power into the hands of social media. Like, one day I realized that if something went wrong with my social media, like if a hacker got a hold of my social media account and disabled it, or made it so that, because I've heard this has happened to a lot of painters that I know, a hacker has gained access to their social media account and basically destroyed it, and they had to start over. Well, I mean, we all know that building the following on Instagram that is a mountain to climb. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And if suddenly you were to just lose access to that, apropos of your question about marketing, I feel like suddenly your ability to self-market is completely cut off. And that worries me, so I do as much as I can to bolster the security of my social media accounts, because I mean, I can't afford to have it lost or corrupted in any way. I need to constantly have control over it, and I use it all the time, not only to market my work or my exhibitions, either solo exhibitions or the exhibitions that that I've curated, but also to market workshops and classes that I'm teaching. So it's so important. So I see it. I know it's less probable. It's less likely that you'll lose your Instagram account to a hacker, but it is possible, and it does happen occasionally. So I think
Yeah,
it is a concern that we need to think about.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's happened to a few of my friends as well. And
Hmm.
it's always a challenge for them to get it back, if if they even get it back, because
If they can
that's
get it
the other
back.
part. Yeah, I mean
Yeah, I've seen people
they
start
were able to.
over.
Yeah,
That's good.
I do
Yeah.
have, yeah, like at least two of the people I know who have their account hacked, they were able to somehow get it back. But this is why two-factor authorization is so important, and
Yes.
all of these
Yeah.
things. Don't click any links that anyone sends you. Don't
No.
trust that ever.
Yeah.
It's usually probably like just a way to steal your data.
Yeah. Right.
So guys,
Yeah.
don't tap any links, please,
Don't tap
from
anything. Yeah.
strange people.
Don't even talk to people sending you weird like requests about, I don't
NFTs.
know, NFTs. Yeah. I
That's the one.
constantly have to delete those.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
get those too. Um, but yes, this is very important. But speaking of challenges, what challenges have you faced, when it comes to the business side of, selling your work and all of that business
Yeah.
aspect? And how have you overcome those challenges?
Great question. I noticed when I was an art student, as I'm sure many of us noticed, that if take a trip to Chelsea, Manhattan, the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan, where all the world's top galleries are. So it's the heart of the art market. You'll notice very quickly, the style and the trends of the work that is largely promoted and shown and reviewed in the art market today. And there's a very narrow spot for traditional classical painters, figurative painters that work in more traditional themes, narrative themes. There's a very narrow slot, number of seats available at the table for artists working in that manner. And I noticed that very early on as a young person, that most of the artwork that was being favored by the art world was really conceptual artwork, artwork that falls in the categories of installations, assemblages, found objects, performance art, multimedia artworks that involve installations and videos and performance. Very avant-garde modes of making art are really what's heavily, it's very disproportionate, the amount that's promoted and the amount that you actually see the type of artwork that we want to do. So there's a very few number of seats at a very huge table available for us. I saw that as a challenge right away, as how are we going to sort of elbow our way in. Frankly, it's still a big problem. It's still a major challenge for artists, especially figurative artists working in a realist tradition. It's very difficult. There's still a lot of thinking in the art world that is not really artwork. That's not really art. That maybe it's more craft driven. Um, and I've seen artists try to embrace that mindset too, or to champion that mindset. I mean, certainly Odd Nerdrum has done that with the kitsch
Mhm.
philosophy that he created, and that he embraced. But it's a very hard challenge to work around. Is that in the end, there's very few galleries that are available to artists that work in that tradition. So that's the challenge. How do you get around it? Um, I think that it's still a very difficult uphill climb. Um, I have found that even the most avant-garde galleries, when you look at their roster, their stable of artists, They might show artwork all over the spectrum of what artists do, from performance to video to installations, to abstract painting. But then they usually like to have one painter, two or three painters, maybe in a stable of like 50 artists that do paint representationally with figurative subject matter. So I think that's something for artists to look carefully at, is that don't assume that these top tier galleries in places like Chelsea, London, Berlin, Copenhagen, don't assume that they are that they're closed off to representational figurative painters. It might be, it's very likely that they would like to have a painter of that ilk in their roster. And you might be the only one. You might not be surrounded by your colleagues and peers, but you will find yourself in a top tier cutting edge gallery that does make the rounds to these world fairs and will take your work and show it in Miami and New York and Chicago and Seattle and Los Angeles, and you get to be part of the art world, and you might experience some exciting sales that way. Um, and I think that's an important thing for artists to look at, is don't necessarily write off galleries as, oh, they're that, they just show that, they're not going to want to show what I do.
Mm.
Um, Going back to my own personal challenges as a painter, I find that that my own flavor of figurative realism, the flavor that comes out of my brush, my own singular brush, tends to be not classical enough for classical venues. Um, Galleries that really promote and champion academic painting, I find that I'm on the outside of that. At the same time, my artwork is not avant-garde enough, to be in forums like, Juxtapose magazine or Hyperallergenic, where there are realist painters that are working and getting a lot of attention, and they're working in very contemporary, hip modes of painting, and the subject matter is very contemporary, very cutting edge. Um, I find that I'm not in that community, or my work doesn't really fit in that spectrum either. So I fall in this strange middle that it's hard to find yourself at home in any given gallery. So I'm fortunate that I have two galleries that I show with that seem to support what I do. One of those is Winfield Gallery in Carmel, and I really like the stable of artists that he has. I feel like I'm in really good company with artists like Camille Corey shows with him, Christian Fagerland, Patricia Watwood. Chris Winfield has paintings by Ted Schmidt. I've seen works by Alan Feltis, who shows with Forum Gallery. So yeah, Mark Trujillo is another contemporary painter that I really like from Los Angeles, who shows with Chris Winfield. So I like the community there. Some others I should mention at Chris Winfield are Warren Chang, and David Laguerre is a major painter whose works are in the Jung Museum in San Francisco. So I like that community. I feel good about showing with Chris Winfield. I show with a gallery in New York City, Dacia Gallery on the Lower East Side, and Dacia is really committed to figurative, narrative, representational paintings, and really supportive of that work. And I feel really at home there. So I feel lucky that I found galleries that are supportive of my work, but it's not easy. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of conversations and meeting people. It takes a lot of walking around cities like New York, Los Angeles, London, to see what the flavors of these galleries are like. How do they present the work? What's the neighborhood like? What are their other artists like? The kind of work. Do I want to be part of that community or not? It takes a lot of work. It's probably the most difficult thing for the contemporary figurative realist to do is to fill that part of the picture of their career is the gallery. It's really equivalent to a recording artist, a musician getting signed by a record label. It's, you don't just walk in and say, oh, I'll record with you guys, and they say, great. It's not, it's the same thing. And I think for an artist having a gallery, it does feel like it validates your work to clientele and to the art world. At the same time, I think a big challenge for me, for everybody, for all artists and for all galleries is that with the advent of social media and the power being put more in the hands of the artists, galleries are struggling to survive. It's harder for them to sell paintings and to make their rents. And they have to really work hard and stay on their toes to make sales and to have an income to keep the galleries afloat. So we're at this weird moment where it's still very, I think it's important for an artist to have a gallery. It's just that so that they can exhibit, they can have shows. I think that's a fulfilling part of being a painter. It's not okay to just make the paintings and not show them. They have to be exhibited. It's part of the process of being a painter, And I think showing in a gallery is really the best way to do it. I mean, if you can have a show in a museum, that's great, but that's very rare. If you can have a show in a museum-like setting, or an exhibition-like setting, it might be, I think a lot of new painters will start out even showing in stores, retail stores, or cafes. We all know about that. I mean, I think that should be done. If that's your first step, do it. Have a show in a restaurant that wants to show off your work. Do it. And slowly work up your way up the ladder. But it is a weird time where galleries are not necessarily thriving. They're still here. They're still among us. They're still important. They still have really big, exciting openings, and those openings get reviewed in papers and magazines. And they're and the openings are well attended by big, exciting opening receptions. So they're still relevant and important, and yet they have lost a lot of their power because of social media and artists deciding that, you know what, if I can become a famous artist just by putting all my work and energy into my social media account, which has happened in a lot of cases, I'll just do that. I don't want to have to go and grovel at the foot of a gallerist, or really the gallerist's assistant, I don't want to have to grovel for some attention from them when I can just put my energy and time into my own social media account, and I'll get 800,000 followers and I'll be famous. And then the galleries will come to me, so that's a valid point.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen in the long run. What is it going to mean for galleries? And what is it going to mean for social media? Because I think social media is changing when they're noticing that they're making people celebrities for free. They kind of think, well, wait a minute, we have a real power at our fingertips. Maybe we should try to impose control on that, or maybe we should capitalize on that more. I mean, that's going to be an obvious outcome to that problem too. I think there were a lot of lucky artists. I wish I was one of them, who took Instagram seriously from day one when it was just this new thing that only a few people were doing. I mean, those people are celebrities now. They have followings that are in the millions, and it's simply because they got in at the ground level. They got in on day one. I remember hearing about Instagram at the beginning and kind of going, "Oh gosh, not another one of these. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do it." And I didn't get involved in it until it was already a force, and I've been penalized for that, really, because now there's algorithms in place that restrict your growth, as we all know. And I still love Instagram, and I need it, and I'm dependent on it. But I wish I had gotten in earlier. I wish I had taken it seriously more early on. So that's another challenge, I think, that we all face, that I face in marketing, is navigating the constraints of social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about
Yeah,
the galleries too, it's like I feel like the pandemic also did a number on them.
yeah,
A lot of
that's
galleries
true.
closed then.
Yeah,
So I
you're
feel
right.
like the few that are left are like they're there. They're hanging on.
Hmm.
But one of the galleries that I really liked, which was Booth Gallery, it's
Oh
gone,
yeah.
which is so
Oh, is it
sad.
gone?
Well,
Yeah, I've been to
the
Booth Gallery.
physical
Yeah,
location closed.
yeah,
And I don't know if they're gonna reopen. I know that Paul Booth, I think he's still doing his tattoo stuff.
right.
But I don't know if he's ever gonna open up the gallery again. So I was a little sad when that happened.
Yeah, that was a great gallery. They were supportive of realism, and
Yes.
they had a great location in Manhattan. I saw a show there several years ago called something like the New Baroque. And it
Mm,
was curated by Robert Zeller. Um, and it was a great show. It had Odd Nerdrum and Adam Miller and Bo Bartlett and Karl Dobsky was in it. And yeah, it was a great show.
mm,
So
mm.
galleries like that, I think we need to get more of those back. We need more
Yeah.
options. And
Yes.
I know that I don't want to sound like I'm complaining about the art world because a lot of us do. A lot of us realists that are traditional painters, we can get real whiny real fast about the art world. And I understand, I totally understand the feeling that, anyone who's listening to this, I totally understand. But it is a way to sort of be shut down and excluded real fast. If you sort of make that your whole MO and your identity that you're complaining about the art world, that's like the fastest way to definitely be excluded. I think that it's important to embrace everything that's going on in the art world, to look at it, take it seriously, just because it's not oil paint on canvas, it might be a video installation. It still has themes and topics and psychology and philosophy. And we should all be looking at that and thinking about it and not writing it off or
Mhm.
discounting it as that's not real art. I think that a lot of us classical traditional painters realize we have to be careful that we don't go down that road.
Yeah.
Because I've seen people that want to they want to turn it into kind of a war, like let's take up arms and reclaim the art world. And I feel you, I understand the feeling because we've been shut out a lot, and we've sort of been excluded or not taken seriously. So I'm not saying that those feelings are invalid, but I don't think the way to win that fight is to sort of take up arms and get angry about it.
Yeah.
Um, it's so it's not fair. I see that. I've heard a metaphor before where it's like if you go into a music store when there used to be music stores, so maybe this analogy doesn't work anymore. You go into a music store that existed in the 90s or the 80s, right? And you ask the staff, like, I really would like, um, I'd like to find this, I'm just going to say jazz album. Okay. I want to find this album by Miles Davis. And they would say to you, oh, we don't carry jazz at all. And then you'd say, well, we're a music store. And they'd say, well, yeah, we have everything from pop and rock and metal and reggae and country. We don't sell jazz. And it's like, well, why not? I mean, that's very much the contemporary art world is like that. When you go
Hmm.
to all the top tier galleries in Chelsea, in New York, what you're doing is walking into a music store that has selected one type of music that does not sell that music. And it seems very unfair, and it's very confusing. I don't understand it, and people keep saying it's going to change. Um, they've been saying that since I was 18, and I'm 47 now. So I don't know that it's going to change. So I don't think that the right tactic is to say let's take up arms and to revolt.
Hmm.
I think you just have to make your best artwork. You have to paint in a way that's true for you. I think you have to paint in a way that taps into the deep themes that inspired you when you were a kid, a teenager, a college student that inspire you now. Like, be honest with yourself, paint that subject matter, make sure that you're passionate about it, do your best work, get it out there as much as you can, elbow your way in to the room, even if it's in a community that doesn't really understand what you're doing, but get yourself a voice at the table, and it's hard, but it takes work, but it can be done.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's just,
Yeah.
chugging along, keep going.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. So I wanted to ask you, can you tell us
Yeah.
about your online classes and workshops?
Yeah, I've got a lot of online workshops and classes and in-person ones too, not just online. In terms of marketing these days, I find it's hard. I feel like the audience might be confused because I promote this workshop and then this in-person class and then this online workshop, and they always need promotions and marketing and advertising, and I feel like I worry sometimes that audiences are, they don't know what particular workshop I'm promoting, but I've got a number of them going on. I think just at random, listing randomly. Every summer I teach an in-person figure painting workshop. That's a 6-day workshop in San Francisco, and this year it's going to be from June 3rd to June 8th. And it's in a large studio in San Francisco with a model. And we paint all day long from life, working with indirect painting techniques, meaning that simply that there's an underpainting followed by various full color painting techniques on top. So that's that workshop in a nutshell. Another class that I'm teaching online, which is live online, is for the New York Academy of Art. And that will be offered every semester for 6 class meetings in a row. So it'll be on Saturdays, and it's a figure drawing class. So it's a class I call Figure Drawing Concept and Perception. And simply that when we draw the figure, when we work with figurative subject matter, a big part of what we're doing is concept driven, things like understanding proportion, anatomy, or conceptualizing the figure as a series of volumes and masses. But then a big part of what we're doing is learning to treat our eye like a lens, and how to interpret light and light behavior on form, and how to achieve realist qualities in our drawings and paintings. So we're doing the artist, the figurative realist is really kind of doing both at the same time, concept and perception. So that's a 6 class meeting online Saturdays through the New York Academy of Art. And you can find information about that on their website. Um, Other workshops that I teach are with the Teaching Studios of Art, which has a big online presence, and they have a number of workshops that I've taught in the past that are fully recorded, which work really excellently for students to purchase the workshop and to work along asynchronously on their own at their own pace. They follow along with the recording of the workshop. They have access to all the reference materials, all the demonstrations, and they're also able to meet with me by scheduling independent Zoom meetings that are 10 minutes long, where I give them quick critiques and feedback as they work their way through the projects. And also with Teaching Studios of Art, every year I usually do about 2 or 3 online live workshops of different topics. So we have another one of those that I'll be advertising for March, which should be full color portrait painting using a full extended palette. Uh, Other workshops. Hope I'm not leaving anything out. I every semester I teach courses. For those of you listening that are in California, I teach at the College of San Mateo, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm just wrapping up a semester where I have a portrait class, and I have also a plein air painting class. And next semester, starting in January, I'm teaching life drawing, which is really figure drawing that's focused on anatomy and proportion and long poses. And I also teach my portrait class as well next semester. So yeah, I think that's at a quick glance. I think those are all the workshops that I have on the palette, so to speak, right now. Yeah, I probably left one out, but I think
Oh,
that's the gist of it. They're all available on my workshops page on my website. If you go to my website and find workshops, you'll see everything that I'm offering and everything that I have offered in the past, and you can get a full picture of my offerings that way.
yeah, absolutely. Speaking of, what's your website?
My website is www.noahbuchananart. So it's my name with art at the end of it. And it's a wonderful website. I love it. It's by Fazo and BoldBrush. And I think it's an excellent website. And I've been encouraging a lot of people to check out their offerings. And I've never been happier with a website before. So
Yeah.
I'm really
Yeah.
proud of it. So please visit.
Yes. And also your Instagram?
My Instagram is at Noah.Buchanan. So there's just a dot between my first and last name. But please come take a look and follow if you can.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Noah, for the
Thank
engaging
you,
and
Laura.
wonderful conversation.
This has been great. Yeah, no, it's been great to meet you, and I'm
Yeah,
following
you
you
too.
now, and I love your work, and
Oh,
this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your interest,
thank you. I love
and
your
I
work
hope
too.
that
And
thank you.
yeah, of course.